Today I'm getting to visit with my dear friend Jim Casada, actually in his childhood home. Looks kind of, the part we're in right now is a little bit different than his childhood home. It's been an added on, but still, it's pretty neat to be back at home, I guess, for you.
Oh, no question.
Yeah.
Bryson City remains a home of my heart 80 years after the fact. And my brother and sister-in-law, Don and Susan, have renovated this old house, which is one of the oldest in the community, and done wonders. But there's nothing. Thomas Wolfe may have said you can't go home again, but you can go home again in your mind.
Yeah.
And it's a joy to be here.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to do a lot of visiting as the day goes on, but this morning we're going to talk about Jim's most recent book, Fishing for Chickens. It is a fantastic book, so we're going to talk about that. And I'll be sure to tell you where you can pick it up and all those wonderful details. But Jim is a very prolific writer. That's why I said his most latest book. So you've been writing for how long?
Well, in some senses, since I was in high school, but my first published work of a popular knowledge, or for a popular audience, came around 1980, so 40 plus years, and I'd written some scholarly material before that. I'm a recovering university professor, but took early retirement to write full time, and I have tried to turn out roughly a book a year or every 2 years, and at my peak 150 or so articles. Now I've cut back, but I still am working hard on books, and in fact, as you shared with your audience not too long ago, Tipper and I are doing a book together. Now she saw right through me. I did drag her kicking and screaming into the project because I've been after her for years to do a book, and I finally thought, well, maybe, just maybe, if I say we do it together, she'll come along. And so she's carrying most of the load on that new book, and but that's a new dimension, because you'll be the first person other than my late wife that I've ever written anything with. So we're pretty well, we're in the short rows for sure on that book. And we haven't come to pulling one another's hair. Well, I don't have any hair to pull, but working remotely, things have gone quite smoothly.
Oh yeah, and Jim's not being truthful. He's definitely carried the load on that. But in all the years that you have been writing, you've been very successful in many different areas. When I first met Jim many years ago now, but when I was telling Matt about meeting Jim, the first thing he said was, I've been reading him for years. And I was like, really? Where? And it was in hunting magazines. So Jim, a lot of your writing over the years has been like the outdoor nature of fishing and hunting and just general outdoor.
Yeah, that's where I made any mark that I've made, was as an outdoor writer with a few specialties, deer hunting, turkey hunting, and particular, and on the fishing side, trout fishing, fly fishing for trout, and I still produce material. A good many articles a year in that area, but in the last decade, in fact, mostly since I've known you, I've turned increasingly to my Highland homeland and writing about the Smokies, local history, regional characters, and that's sort of a coming full circle, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah, I've noticed that, and that was, in fact, one of the things I wanted to talk about. So, of course, I talk about all of Appalachia on my channel and on the Blind Pig and the Acorn, but like you, what my specialty, if I even have a specialty, would be what's in Brasstown. That's what I'm most familiar with, because that's where I've lived. But in the same for you, having grown up, I love you call yourself a son of the Smokies, having grown up right here in the Smokies, and that's where you first fell in love with the hunting and the fishing and the outdoor life. But for a lot of people, and you know, we have viewers from all over the world. They're not even familiar with the United States necessarily, but even folks that live here, it gets kind of confusing. Like Appalachia, well, where is that? And you know, then you can think about the Appalachian chain of mountains that goes very long, much longer than people think. But then within that, there's several little subsets, I would say, and definitely the Smoky Mountains is one of them. And it gets confusion for people, because a lot of people even say, well, they assume that that's where I live, but I don't live in the Smoky Mountains where I'm at, but I'm close to it. So could you kind of talk about the range of the Smoky Mountains?
The Smokies,
Yeah.
literally, in the truest sense of the word, is a geographical term.
Right.
And the Smoky Mountain range encompasses all or parts of just a few counties. And primarily Swain and Haywood County, a little bit of Graham County in North Carolina, and then a couple of counties, 3 counties, on the Tennessee side. So, and the other thing that can be confusing when you say Smokies, a lot of people think immediately of the park. Well, certainly 500,000 acres of the Smokies is the park, but the region all around where folks still live is the Smokies as well. But in many senses, I think the Smokies do epitomize what Southern Appalachia is all about, because they're right at the heart of Southern Appalachia. But having said that, and I have found this out mainly through comments on the predecessor book to Fishing for Chickens, was a memoir, a childhood memoir, a Smoky Mountain Boyhood, that came out a couple of years ago. And a lot of people commented on it, particular chapters that I might write about how I caught bait to fish with, or the foodstuffs we raised, or something like that. And he said, well, your boyhood was just like mine. And so what that said to me, other than geographical place setting, that in a wider sense, unknowingly, I was writing about a time and a way of life as much as I was a geographical setting.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even the things that I write about that find that to be true. Maybe somebody in the Midwest or Pacific Northwest or wherever Canada identify, even though they're so many miles away. But would you say still there are some things that are kind of unique to the region?
There are, hunting and fishing first. Not everywhere in Appalachia has trout fishing, and I cut my fishing teeth fly fishing for trout. My dad was an avid fly fisherman, and so from as far back as my memory goes, I tagged along with him, and then before I reached 10 years old, had a fly rod of my own. So that's one example, but there are other things too. And it's really hard to come to grips with, but my brother and I were talking about it last night. There is a very localized sense of community. And I'm not talking about just Swain County or the Smokies, even subsets within that. There's a creek, as the crow flies, not 5 miles from where we are, Alarka Creek, all the locals call it Larky. And people that grew up or live on Alarka, clannish is not the right word, but they have a great sense of togetherness, a very localized sense of togetherness. And same thing is true up on the Cherokee Reservation of Big Cove. The people in both places are more conservative, and that's not to say they're backward at all. It's simply that they are wedded to the old ways in a meaningful fashion. And then it's true of neighboring Graham County. Graham County, some folks might say, is the most backwards county of the 100 counties in North Carolina. I would probably go in the opposite direction, because years ago, Don and I went in to an Ingles store over there to get a few last minute things. We were going on a camping trip. And when we checked out, there was a teenage girl who was a cashier. And as soon as she opened her mouth, Don said, "I'm in love with you," because she had the finest old-time Appalachian accent and was still a teenager. And so there are some of those little things that I can pick up. And language and way of expression. I know some of your most popular work focuses on language use. And there are colloquialisms that just spout out of my mouth all the time. I don't even think about it. And someone will say, "What did you just say?" Or, "What does that mean?"
Yeah.
And then I'll stop and think about it and explain.
Right, yeah. Fascinating, all that to think about those little sections and subsets and hollers and coves and
Right.
all the different things. So Jim kind of mentioned his previous book, and I'll make sure to link to that too. And that was kind of your whole life story, basically.
It was up to the age of about 22 when I
Yeah,
finished
yeah.
college, and it was just bits and pieces, 40 odd chapters and 300 plus pages of things I knew and experienced. It was very personal. It was it was an autobiography.
Right, yeah.
It was what it was, although some of the chapters, there's one devoted to my paternal grandfather, Jim Casada, who I absolutely adored, and he was he epitomized mountain eccentricity. He was as square as you could possibly be, sought in his ways, but we just jihad perfectly. There's something about the separation of a generation that he didn't have to discipline me, he didn't have to control me, and as long as we didn't antagonize Grandma and Minnie too much, everything just went smoothly. And so that chapter's on him, but he was a great influence on my life, second only to my parents. And but mostly I talk about teachers, I talk about things I did as a boy, a lot of mischief that I got into, just what it was like to grow up in the 1950s. That's what the book is really about, is the lifestyle I knew as a boy. And I didn't know it until I left home, went to college. I was as naive as you can possibly be. I had spent exactly 3 nights in a hotel room or a motel room when I went off to college. I had never seen the ocean. I didn't see the ocean until I was 25. I hadn't missed anything. I found that out. My wife loved it, and we went to the ocean on our honeymoon. But I was perfectly at home in these mountains. And the other thing I learned is I always thought we were comfortable, and we were. We had plenty of food on the table, and we had enough clothes to wear. But I learned when I went off to college that by a lot of folks' standards, we were poor, and we were poor in an economic sense, but we were mighty rich in a lot of other ways, in lifestyle.
Yeah, and that's just a fantastic book. So like I said, I'll make sure to give you that information too. In the description below will be all those links to Jim's great books. So that was that book kind of, like you said, told all your stories from when you were a child up into your early 20s. And kind of a moment ago when you were talking about how people identified it with it that didn't live in the Smokies, maybe not even in Appalachia, in that same way, people all over the world, we all identify with food. It's the food that we grew up on, and sometimes it's even, in poor, like you were talking about being poor, maybe it's, I've told this story a lot, so I know my viewers have already heard it, but the family that told me all they had was cornbread. A lot of times they were so poor when they were growing up, and they swore they would never eat that again. Maybe they had cornbread and milk, or they had cornbread and syrup, but then when better times come along and they were grown and now they can have what they want cornbread and milk, or they want cornbread and syrup. So food plays such a role in all of our memories and things. So the fishing for chickens is really your memories tied to food, would you say?
Oh, it is. The subtitle of the book is A Smokies Food Memoir, and that's exactly what it is. It is not. It has a lot of recipes, but it is not a cookbook. The recipes are simply examples of the foodstuffs and the way of raising them, whether it's preacher meat, chicken, or pork, which was the main meat of the Appalachians really well toward the end of the last century. Or if it's corn, corn was the mainstay on the vegetable side of life. And I just talked about what we ate, how we grew it, how we raised it, how we hunted it, or how we caught it, and then offered recipes along with a lot of anecdotes connected with the various things that were a part of life in producing food. And as you just said, food is a commonality. I once asked a class of students when I was teaching history for 3 years in the military school before I went off to graduate school, what was the greatest drive in life? What was the thing that drove you most? And this being a bunch of testosterone-laden teenage boys in a military school, every one of them said sex. And I said, no, it's food. I said, if you're starving to death, you're not interested in the opposite sex, you want a meal. And
Right.
food is the driving factor in life in that regard.
So the name of the book is interesting in itself, and I know there's a story behind that I'll let you tell, but just what you were just saying, food is that thing that binds us all together that we have to have. And in your childhood days of growing up, it was, everyone lived. Today it's kind of, myself included, we yearn to live close to the land again, but we don't necessarily as much as they did in your childhood, and certainly in your grandpa and grandma's time. But in those days, everything, I mean, you had to have food, and therefore you had to figure out how to get it by growing and hunting and doing all those things. So that took up a large part of your time, and in that, of course, they had their own methods and ways of doing what they needed to do. So that actually plays into the title, is a very interesting way that your Grandpa Joe.
Right. He raised chickens. Everybody raised chickens because you didn't eat them so much. I think I mentioned preacher meat earlier. Chicken was a special dish. You had it when family came or when the preacher came. That's why it was called preacher meat. Or there's a wonderful old song that Bobby Bear did and a bunch of other people, chicken every Sunday, Lord, chicken every Sunday. And we had in this house chicken every Sunday, and Mama could fry chicken better than anyone that's ever been. I know a lot of people say that about their mama, but she had a way of doing it. It was exceptional. But the fishing for chickens comes from how Grandpa Joe got chickens when Sunday was coming or the family was going to be there or whatever. He didn't catch chickens like most people did. The common way was to lift one off the roost. That was the most common way of catching one. And free-range chickens, you just don't walk up and pull it out of a cage.
Right.
Or you don't buy it off of grocery shelves,
Right.
which is what people think of today. You had to catch the chickens. Well, he was a firm believer that if you lifted a chicken off the roost, it put all the other chickens sort of off their laying because there would be a ruckus invariably. It's after dark and disturbed all the other chickens. And similarly, he thought if you tried to chase one down, a free-range chicken, and hem it up against some bushes or something, you're disturbing them. So he observed his chickens very closely, and he had dozens of them. He knew when a hen or two hens were not doing their best laying duties, when they'd gotten slack in the egg producing business. Y'all have chickens, you see some of that, I'm sure. There'll be a hen that goes off her duties for whatever reason.
Right.
Well, that hen or those hens, in his case, were pretty soon destined for the dinner table. And the way he caught them to avoid any of those disturbances bothering the other chickens, he used a fishing pole. He had a big, long cane pole, probably 20 feet long. And on the end of it, he had about 2 feet of old-time black nylon line with a hook. And he'd walk out among the chickens, and when they saw him coming, they'd start flocking up because they knew that there was every likelihood of scratch feed, and that's what would happen. He'd have a handful of scratch feed, and he'd scatter it out, and people don't know what scratch feed is. Cracked corn is what it is. And of course, every chicken that he had would be right there. And he would get ready. He'd wait until one of those chickens that hadn't been doing what she should be doing in the way of egg production got off the side a little. And he had pinched a tiny bit of cornbread on that hook. He'd just drop it right in front of that chicken. And everybody that lives in this part of the world's heard the old expression, like a chicken on a June bug. Well, it was like a chicken on a piece of cornbread. And then there was the awfulest commotion imaginable. He'd start the chicken swallow the hook, chicken was caught. And he'd start pulling it in, and it wouldn't pass muster with PETA today, but he'd pick it up and wring the chicken's neck and that was that. And if company was coming, Grandma needed more than one, it might be repeated a couple more times. Chickens never learned. Somehow it didn't bother them. He could go throw more scratch feed, they'd be feeding again, he'd get another one. Now, I told this story to a woman recently, a local woman who was surprised. She said, "Ooh, I can't imagine that." I said, "Well, it was just practical." I said he was very practical. It was a sensible way. He didn't have to exert much effort. It never failed, and
he didn't upset his
he didn't,
in production,
right?
which he was dependent on.
He didn't interfere with that, and so. I didn't choose the title, but I had told the story in a chapter in the book on chickens, and I understand the logic behind it. The folks at the University of Georgia Press who published the book chose it, and the whole idea is you see fishing for chickens, what in the world is that about? It raises a question in a potential reader's mind, and that was just life. It was a circle of life, and chickens didn't come off of grocery store shelves all packaged up. You took care of it from the raising to the end of their life, to plucking the chicken until it appeared on the dinner table, almost always on Sunday.
Yeah, wow. That's a great story. Yeah, great story. So Jim said it didn't have many recipes in it, but it does have some wonderful recipes in it for anyone that likes to cook. But I love that it's kind of like you said, you highlight the importance of corn or pork or whatever. So it's kind of like the day-to-day stuff that you would eat. But then you've also got some chapters about like more we think of like the special, the fancy doings, like at Christmas or at Thanksgiving or those things.
Right, I devote separate chapters to that because those two holidays in particular, and some others, but those two were the food-wise were the most important, and Mama absolutely loved them. She loved preparing, she loved cooking, she loved talking about them, she loved decorating, but most of all she loved the togetherness, and food was the glue that brought that binding of togetherness. And so I mean, she would be talking about Thanksgiving for weeks ahead, and she had any number of recipes that she prepared. She had two kinds of pumpkin pie. One wouldn't do. She had a baked pie and a refrigerated pie made out of pumpkin. And also at Thanksgiving, she made my all-time favorite recipe, was what she called an applesauce cake. And it did have applesauce in it, but to me, what made it was black walnuts. Black walnuts have a distinctive taste that it's the culinary equivalent of lace on a bride's pajamas. It's just walnuts, whether it's in a oatmeal cookie or in Mama's applesauce cake, just make a world of difference. So there's talk about that, or discussion of that, and what we typically ate, and it was, we almost always had chicken, baked chicken, not turkey, but chickens at Thanksgiving. But there would be pork too, because that was, usually Thanksgiving came a week or 2 weeks after hog killing time. And so there would probably, quite possibly, still be fresh pork. So there'd be pork tenderloin and gravy. And I would be hard put to think of anything in the meat line that I like more, although properly fried squirrel the way Mama did it was mighty fine too.
Yeah. Over the years, I've heard so much about Jim's mother, I almost feel like I know her. Of course, I didn't know her, I would have loved to. But I love that she got that excited and she got that pleased because she liked to, I'm sure she enjoyed eating, but she loved to cook for her family. That was, and I think that's like and again, I'm not saying it's not like that all over the world, but for me especially, but even Jim, we can only speak to what we know. Jim knows more than I do about the rest of the world. But I think that's a common thing, but especially in the mountains of Appalachia, including, of course, the Smoky Mountains, is that that wonderful desire to be happy and to comfort and to, I mean, it all gets tied in together. The good, even they were poor, like you said, you realized later that you were actually poor. You didn't feel poor, but to be able to provide that nourishment, but also the taste, and they would get so excited about hog killing time or sorghum making time or those different times of the year. It all kind of melds in together to create that sense of family and community.
And there were times of celebration.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I mean,
something to look forward to each year, yeah.
Hog killing might have been terribly, excuse me, terribly hard work, but it was a time of joy.
Right.
People were
look
together.
forward to
And Mama, every Christmas, she would say, you could predict at some point during Christmas, maybe at a meal, I think this is the best Christmas ever.
Yeah.
Well, every Christmas was the best Christmas ever. But Mama, she was a child at holidays. I mean, she was a highly productive child when it came to working culinary wonders. But if I may, I'll share an anecdote from Christmas that typifies her. She could not stand amidst all of her baking and preparing and everything. She couldn't stand to leave a gift under the Christmas tree for her without picking it up and shaking it and looking at it, and I wonder what it is. Yeah. She'd do it 20 times, just like a child.
Yeah.
And I think it's partly because she never had really a Christmas as a child herself. Her mother died when she was an infant, and her father basically left her and her sister to be raised by family, and she had a tough childhood. But so Christmas meant was extra special to her, and she wanted to be for everyone else. But she became a child at Christmas with food, but with gifts. And one gift, we always gave gag gifts in our family. Everybody got a gag gift of some kind and had a laugh at their expense from others. But one Christmas season, Don and Susan, brother and sister-in-law, got her a gag gift that they put in a box, and it was wrapped carefully and everything. But when Mama picked it up, she was shaking a little, and it just rattled and made the awfulest racket. And she was really mystified. That was the first thing she wanted to open on Christmas Day. Well, it was a bunch of dry pinto beans that came in a little box that said Smoky Mountain Bubble Bath.
Oh, goodness.
And she couldn't say a thing for about 30 seconds, and then the closest she ever would come to an expletive came out of her mouth. Oh, shoot. But Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter. Easter was celebrated in a big way, and of course eggs were very much in the forefront at Easter, and chicken. But they were times of celebration, and food. Food was at the forefront. Food meant the most, and I devote a great deal of time to that in the book because they loom so large in my memory.
Right. Yeah. So for anyone that, just like Jim and I both were trying to say in a roundabout way, it's kind of hard to describe it, but what food means to whatever culture that you're in. But if you're interested in the Appalachian culture and also definitely in the Smoky Mountains, but I would say, as Jim did earlier, it goes even further than that, kind of like a country, I guess, setting, whether you're in the Midwest or wherever. Fishing for Chickens is definitely a book that you want to get and you'll enjoy all the stories, but then it does have so many great recipes, but so many stories just like the one that Jim shared about his mother, and lots of information too about the foodways, whether it was corn or pork or the hog killing, all those kind of things that, like Jim was saying, that come up each year that people look forward to. So make sure that you get your copy. I'll leave that the information in the description below. I'll also leave the link to Jim's website, jimcasaoutdoors.com, and you can see a lot of hunting books, outdoor books on there for sale, but you can also sign up for his newsletter that is totally free, don't cost anything, just comes once a month, and it's got a lot of what Jim does, and it kind of what you've heard him talk about today, but he always shares recipes in it. So that's kind of a must thing too if you're interested in the Smoky Mountains, but also kind of in the Appalachian region at large.
Well, as we're wrapping up, I would like to, I guess as I so often do, draw on wisdom from Grandpa Joe, and it's applicable here in a lot of ways. He was very soft-spoken. In fact, you had to listen intensely to hear him. He almost talked in a whisper. But when the family would get together, he always did the blessing, said grace, and he would say whatever was appropriate or whatever was in his mind. But he had the same ending every time. And it went, you and see what's before you, eat hearty, and amen. You'ns have heard what's before you, and I hope you'll find some hearty reading.
Oh, they will for sure.